Hi everyone. How's the sound? Good. Yeah. Today I want to talk to you about building detail-oriented UIs with the help of layout margins. But first, a couple words about me. My name is Marina. I'm originally from Russia, but I live in Copenhagen now for about 5 years. I've been doing iOS development for 8 years full-time now, and today I work at Storytel, which is all-you-can-eat book subscription service offering ebooks and audiobooks. So what are we going to talk about today? So first, we're going to look into what is actually the problem that we're trying to solve. Then I'm going to show you how layout margins can help us do things a little bit better. And last but not least, I'm going to show you some tips on how you can go for a completely numberless layout if you want to. And before we dive in, a little disclaimer. So this is a talk about UIKit. And you might ask, is this still relevant with Swift UI at the door? And I think it is relevant still, because Swift UI requires iOS 13, and it's going to be a while until our production apps that we build at our day jobs and that have many users can realistically bump their minimum supported version to that. And in the meantime, we also have to keep building new features, keep supporting existing features in our apps. And even when Swift UI is something that we adopt in our apps, maybe we won't rewrite all of our existing UIKit code into Swift UI just for the sake of it. So a lot of tips that I will give today and a lot of things that I will talk about today is something that you can apply already today in your job. So what is actually the problem? When you're building a new feature in your app, or maybe working on the existing feature, improving the designs or the UI, you normally would get designs from your designer. And those can have various levels of detail, from rough wireframes to more detailed and more realistically looking mockups. And then you look at it and you think, OK, I can probably build this. And then you start looking a bit closer and thinking how you can break it down into nice components so it's manageable to implement. And then you start looking a little bit closer, even more, and realize that all of these things actually have to align with each other. And in your nice breakdown into components that you envisioned, you might have to align one element 3 levels deep in one component with another element 5 levels deep in another component. And that can be tricky. So what do you do next? Well, you get to code or interface builder, whichever you prefer. So if you're using auto... OK, this is not good. No, it's good. No, it's OK. Nothing happened. So if you're using auto layout, then maybe you have written or at least have seen code like this, where you're attaching your views to the edge of its super view with some concrete constraint numbers. And if you're using manual layout in some of your components, then you might have seen code like this. And then the more your project grows, you can optimize things and create shared variables, maybe returning different values depending on screen size or if it's iPad or not. And then you can also grow it even more and organize your numbers into constants. And these can grow a lot. It can turn out that it's really hard to work with the more your app grows. Even though it's seemingly configurable, often just changing one number is not enough. Just changing one number, you might need to change a few more, and it's often not immediately obvious which ones and by how much. And then you can think, OK, but I can actually do math on these things. So I have only the minimum numbers I need, and then I can calculate the rest dynamically. And then you might find yourself building a layout margin system, a custom one for your app. And that brings us to the native solution that UIKit has for all of these things that I'm really happy to show you today, and it's called layout margins. So it's based on a really simple concept of every view having layout margins, which is a desired amount of space that that view wants to have between any of its subviews and its edge. So it's basically the inset that you want to have on that view. And in code, it's represented by one simple property called layout margins of type UI edge insets. Most of you have probably seen UI edge insets before, and the corresponding part directional layout margins. And those two have top, bottom, left and right, or leading and trailing, which correspond to user's interface direction. And those have really nice and meaningful default values. So those properties are not optional, and their defaults are not 0. So a plain UI view, if you just create a view and look at its layout margins property, it would have 8 on each side. And if you take a view controller and look at that view controller's view, it will have 15 on right and left. And if we take a plain view controller and embed it in a navigation controller, then it will get system layout margins, which can be different depending on the device, depending on like orientation, basically size class. And right now, those are 16 or 20. Like for iPad or landscape on iPhone, it's 20. And those are the same margins that the system apps have. So if you look at the Contacts app or Mail app or Messages app, this is the margins that they have. So these are really sensible defaults. But if you want to change the margins, it's also quite easy. You can set the whole thing or set it partially if you're using Swift, or you can just set them to 0. But the thing is that just setting those values or them having some default doesn't actually affect your UI unless you look at these values and respect them. So if you're using auto layout, then it's quite simple to get full advantage of layout margins. There's this property called layout margins guide, which defines an area which is located within the margins of your view. And if you don't know what a layout guide is, it's an object that can participate in auto layout calculations. It has various anchors similar to a view, but it's not a view, so it doesn't get rendered on screen. And you can just position your view relative to that. And if you're using Interface Builder, then there's a small checkbox called Constraint to Margins, which will make the constraints that you create go against layout margins guide instead of the view's edges. You have probably seen that one before. So the code that we saw earlier turns into something like this, where instead of attaching the label to the edges plus or minus some concrete number, we just attach it to layout margins guide, and it will be nicely positioned there. And if we want to change some the inset to some custom values, then we can set layout margins property later or right away. And if you're using manual layouts, it's also quite simple. So normally you would do your frame calculations in layout subviews, where you can just look at layout margins property or layout margins guide layout frame to position your subviews against. And in this case of manual layout, then we also need to observe a callback and trigger relayout, which we don't need to do in case of auto layout. It all happens automatically. So the code that we've seen before will turn into something like this, where instead of specific numbers, we say margins left, margins top, which is quite nice, I think. And yeah, we can also set the margins later. So, looks pretty good so far, right? Using this approach makes your code cleaner, because you're using very readable properties called layout margins guide. So any developer looking at your code can read and understand what it does. It also makes your code more native, because again, a developer looking at your code, they can put a cursor on these properties and read the documentation. Or maybe they're already familiar with them. It also makes your code easier to change. because you don't need to meddle with constraints to change the margins of your view if you're changing the design. And it makes your code more reusable, because now you can have your view be positioned in different places where they might need different margins. And those are set outside the view. So pretty good, right? And all of this you can already adopt on per view basis right now in your apps. So you don't need to have all your views in your app use layout margins. It can be per view. You can create a new one and start using this, or you can refactor them one by one. So pretty nice. OK, but the true power of layout margins comes from the runtime support that UIKit has for them. So the actual numbers, the actual margins of your view can be automatically increased by UIKit in runtime without you doing anything, based on two things. Based on all the margins of all your views, super views in the view hierarchy in runtime, or based on safe area, and based on safe area. So let's take a look at these two and how they can really empower us to build complex UIs easily. So I have this, let's take a look at the super view stuff first. So I have an example view here, the blue view, and the area inside it. It looks pretty white, but anyway, is the area within the layout margins. And then I have another view of the same kind, just different color, the red one, and I add it as a subview there. And let's say I increased layout margins of the parent view to some custom value, like 60 pixels, for example. And by default, that doesn't do anything to our red view, to the subview. The margins of the view can still, their content can overlap. If you position the content within the layout margins on the red view, it will extend beyond the margins of its parent. So there's this little property called preserves superview layout margins, which is false by default. But if it's turned on to true, it will tell UIKit that it needs to increase the margin of that view that you set this property on to not overlap with the edges, with the margins of its parent. And it will increase the margins just enough. So it won't just set the margins of the red view to be equal to its parent, but it will just increase it large enough for them to be aligned. So here I have a little bit more realistic example. So I have a view controller, which is embedded inside a navigation controller. And this blue view, I added to it just full screen. So there's no constraints. I could even just set a frame to bounce if I wanted to. And then I enabled preserves superview layout margins, which gives this nice effect that this blue view gets layout margins inherited from the view controller. And as I mentioned earlier, that gets its system values. So now we get our blue view having its layout margins nicely aligned with the navigation bar items and with other things that might be there. And now if I add my red view here, by default, its content can overlap. But if we enable preserves superview layout margins, then the margin gets adjusted just enough, and then all our views get nicely aligned together compared to each other and to the navigation bar and to the navigation bar items. OK, pretty nice. All right. So let's take a quick look at the safe area. So what is safe area? For those who are not familiar with it, safe area is an area of your view that is unobscured by any bars, like status bar, navigation bar, home indicator area, and so on. And there's this property that controls whether something happens to your layout margins based on safe area. And by default, well, if you set it to false, then of course it doesn't do anything. But if set to true, then it, similarly to the superview behavior, adjusts the margins to not overlap with the safe area instead. And this is actually true by default, so which is really nice. So we don't need to do anything in our code to get this kind of behavior. And it's actually pretty hard to get rid of this behavior, because then you have to set it to false on every single view in your view hierarchy. So I don't recommend doing that. Okay, so then these two things, preserving superview margins and safe area margins, can be really powerful and allow us to build really nicely aligned UIs without any kind of custom margin code. So I have a little demo here, and don't worry, it's recorded. It's not a live demo. Yeah, so same view, just added some debug information so we can see the numbers of the values of the actual margins. So same blue view is added, and here we have iPhone 10, which has both safe area and of course layout margins, which all views have. And both of these views have preserving enabled. And this is supposed to animate now. Yes. Yes. So in this demo project, I've set up just a simple pan gesture recognizer that moves the red view, sets the red view's frame. And as the view moves to the edges, you can see that UIKit increases the value just enough for them to be really nicely aligned with the rest of the UI. And this works for all sides, top, bottom, yeah. But the thing is, that if it keeps moving further and further away, the increasing is not going to happen forever. So the UIKit is reasonable. It's not going to make your view extend to 1 million pixels width or something. It will, maximum allow for it to increase by to a value of the superview. So there is some reasonable fallbacks there. All right. So how can we actually use this for real in our apps when we're building things? So I have an example here of a feature or a screen that I've built for an app, for the app I'm working on right now. And so I looked at it long and hard and broke it down into components and all that. So let's look closer at this component. It's like a block component, which is located on a scroll view or collection view. And this component doesn't have anything attached to its margins. But it does preserve its superview's margins, which is a scroll view in this case, which in turn also preserves from its parent, which is a view controller. So it gets the system layout margins values. But I don't attach anything to it. Instead, inside I have another component and another component which also preserve the margins, because I want this nice edge-to-edge scroll on the slider. And then in the title, we can actually start using this layout margins guide and attach the title and the button to the layout margins guide to get this nicely aligned look. And if you're feeling like doing something more complex, then we can also use this layout margins value for more advanced calculations. Like we can set it on scroll views as scroll views content inset to get nice alignment when the scroll view is scrolled all the way. And we can use this value for custom snapping calculations if we want the views to snap to the margin as well. And if you want to use, or if you're ready to use the new compositional layout, which is available from iOS 13, then you can also set section inset to just directly set section inset to be equal to layout margins, and it will sort of just work. But it doesn't have to be only complex UIs where we take advantage of layout margins. It can be simplest things like making sure that your text doesn't touch the edges of its background, so you can attach your label to layout margins. And there's so much more in UIKit that has support for these mechanisms. I'm only going to briefly mention a few things because we don't have time to go through everything today. So the table view has native support for layout margins. So if you look at it, just most native table view with the most native cells, it already takes advantage of the layout margin relative layout. All the title label, detail label, accessory views get positioned against the layout margins. And if you're building your own custom cells, then you can also use that and take cells, content views, layout margins guide, and attach your custom views to those. And there's even more. For example, stack view has also support for this, and by setting one property to true, you can get arranged subviews to be attached to the layout margins instead of the edges of the stack view. And for iPad, where layout margins don't always make sense because it's still quite wide, there is this concept of readable content, which in code is represented by readable width guide, and it's by Apple's terms, the best width that gives the most readable text experience to the user. So it depends on the content size, the content category, and it will be different depending on the dynamic text size. So if you're laying out text, you can use this instead of layout margins, and this will never go outside the layout margins area and always be narrower than that. And the table view has support for that as well, where the cells can have their content laid out against readable width. All right. And last but not least, a small section here about the numberless layout. So if we really want to, which I really want to, I don't know about you, we can achieve a point where there won't be any numbers in our layout code at all. So if you follow system margins to like 16, 20 that you get automatically to be in line with the other apps, other system apps, you don't need a number for that. If you use this layout margin propagation mechanism and set preserving parent margins on all your views, you don't need to do any custom spacing or frame calculations for your for other views in your view hierarchy. And if you use readable width, it helps you make a more readable UIs on larger screens, like in landscape, on phones, and on iPad. And little icing on the cake, what about spacing? There is a system spacing as well. So there's an anchor that you can use called constraint equal to system spacing after. And if you use that, you will get a system value of spacing between the two anchors that you connect with this. And you can have a multiplier saying like half the spacing or double, triple, and so on. So that can be pretty nice. But of course, if you go with completely numberless layout, then you might think, okay, but what about the designers? They often give us the designs that have very specific numbers in them. Like your margin can be 8 or 12 or 20 or whatever number they put on their sketches. And my answer to that is just talk with your designers. It's not necessarily that they intentionally put a specific number. They might not know that iOS has system margins that all the system apps use and that you can get access to without writing any special code for it yourself. So that might not be intentional that they put some other number. So you can educate them on that. Or maybe they just forgot about it. But even if they put specific numbers there on purpose, maybe you end up convincing them to use the system values. But even if you end up having to use custom values for your margins of your main UI, you can still benefit from the propagation by setting layout margins on your view controllers and still take advantage of all the propagation mechanisms to let them go all the way through your view hierarchy. So, summary slide. So, yes, you can use layout margins today already on a per view basis and start slowly incorporating that in your designs and in your UI. you can get the meaningful margins propagated. And that you can also do partially for some parts of your UI without rewriting the whole thing. And when you're making new design, just have an extra thought. Do I really need that number in my code? All right. So if you want to learn more about this, there's a really great session on WWDC last year called Apps for Every Size and Shape. And it goes into very, very much detail into how layout margins, safe area, scroll views, and all of these parts interact in UIKit. And if you haven't seen this up before, I really recommend it. It's called Adaptivity app. And it lets you try all these different margins, readable width, and all kinds of things on the device that you have. So it's a bit more hands-on experience for learning these things. It's not me who created this app. I just think it's really amazing. And they have a free version and a paid version. Yep. So that's it. Thank you. And if you have any questions, you can find me in the break right after.